You've been told lies about early California, the gold rush, the sunshine, the promise of a new beginning. Everything you learned in school painted California as the land of opportunity, where brave pioneers built something beautiful from nothing. But let me tell you what they left out. Let me tell you about the darkness. Early California wasn't a golden dream. It was a waking nightmare where daily life meant confronting horrors that would break most people today within hours. This wasn't about chasing fortune or building a better future. This was about surviving one more day in a place designed to destroy you. You need to understand what daily life actually meant, not the sanitized version from textbooks, the real version. The version where you woke up, if you woke up, surrounded by the smell of human waste and unwashed bodies, where your first thought wasn't about dreams or ambitions, but whether you'd find something to eat, where disease, violence, and death weren't tragic exceptions but expected parts of your routine. The reality of early California was darkness. Physical darkness in cramped, lightless spaces where you tried to sleep. Moral darkness in a society where human life had almost no value. Spiritual darkness when you realized there was no way out, no escape, no hope for anything better. By the end of this documentary, you're going to see exactly what daily existence looked like for ordinary people in 1850s California. Not the lucky few who struck gold, not the entrepreneurs who got rich. The ordinary people, the ones who did the actual work, who suffered through the actual conditions, who died in numbers we'll never fully know. This isn't a story about the American frontier spirit or manifest destiny. This is a story about what happens when humans are pushed beyond their limits, day after day, with no relief and no end in sight. The dark reality of daily life in early California was worse than you can imagine, and I'm about to prove it to you. Let's start with what it really felt like to live through a single day in that hellish place. We're talking about California from roughly 1848 to 1865, the gold rush era and its immediate aftermath. To understand the darkness of daily life during this period, you need to grasp how utterly alien this world was from anything we experience today. California in 1850 was barely part of the United States. It had just been seized from Mexico 2 years earlier. The population exploded from about 14,000 non-native people in 1848 to over 300,000 by 1855. This wasn't gradual settlement. This was an invasion of desperate people flooding into a territory with zero infrastructure. Imagine a place with no real government, no established law enforcement, no medical system, no sanitation, no reliable food supply, and no social services of any kind. Now fill that place with hundreds of thousands of people from different countries, speaking different languages, all competing desperately for resources. That was California. The landscape itself was hostile. The Sierra Nevada mountains were deadly. Extreme cold, avalanches, impossible terrain that trapped and killed travelers every winter. The Central Valley baked under temperatures exceeding 110 degrees in summer, with no shade and scarce water. Deserts stretched across the south, killing anyone foolish enough to cross unprepared. The settlements that formed were barely functional. San Francisco in 1850 was a muddy disaster of tents and hastily constructed wooden buildings that burned down repeatedly. 6 major fires in just 3 years. The streets were unpaved mud mixed with garbage and human waste. During rainy season, you could sink to your knees trying to cross a street. Mining camps were even worse. These were temporary clusters of tents and lean-tos built wherever someone thought they might find gold. They had no planning, no organization, no permanence. When the gold ran out, which it usually did quickly, the camp was abandoned, leaving behind trash, graves, and the ruins of desperate dreams. There were no roads connecting these places, just rough trails that turned to impassable mud in winter and choking dust in summer. Traveling between settlements could take days or weeks, and you risked being robbed, injured, or killed along the way. Communication was almost non-existent. News traveled slowly if it traveled at all. If something happened to you 100 miles from where you started, your family might never know. You could simply disappear, and no one would ever find out what happened. The social environment was just as dark as the physical one. California attracted criminals, con artists, and violent men who saw the chaos as opportunity. It also attracted ordinary people who were quickly brutalized by the conditions. Decent people did terrible things because the environment demanded it. There was no sense of community or mutual support in most places. Everyone was competing for the same scarce resources. Trust was dangerous. Kindness was exploited. The only law was what you could enforce yourself, and most people couldn't enforce anything. The darkness wasn't just metaphorical. At night, there was virtually no light, no street lights. Candles and oil lamps were expensive, so most people lived in near-total darkness after sunset. The nights were filled with sounds that kept you awake: fights, screams, gunshots, the groans of sick and dying people nearby. This was the world. This was the stage on which daily life played out. And every single day was a struggle against this darkness, knowing that the darkness was winning. Most people who came to California during this era experienced a descent into a life darker than anything they'd known before. And for most of them, they never climbed back out. Let's walk through an actual day in early California. Not a dramatic day, just a normal day. Because the darkness wasn't in the exceptional moments, it was woven into every hour of ordinary existence. You wake up, though wake up isn't quite right because you never really slept. You were cold all night or hot, depending on the season. Your back aches from sleeping on the ground or on wooden planks with no mattress. The person next to you, a stranger, was coughing all night, a wet, rattling cough that probably means tuberculosis. You breathe the same air for 8 hours. You open your eyes to darkness. Even if it's morning, there's barely any light in your tent or the cramped room you share with a dozen other people. The smell hits you immediately. Unwashed bodies, human waste from the bucket in the corner that no one emptied yesterday, rotting food, smoke, mildew. This smell is your constant companion. You never escape it. You'll carry it on your own body. You're thirsty, desperately thirsty. You've been thirsty since yesterday afternoon when the water barrel ran low. There's a river nearby, but you know what's in that river. You've seen the mining operations upstream dumping waste. You've seen the latrines, when they exist at all, built right on the bank. You've seen dead animals floating past, but you're thirsty enough that you'll drink it anyway. You go outside to relieve yourself. There's no toilet. There's a designated area if you're lucky, or you just walk behind the nearest building or into the brush. You squat in the mud in the dark, hoping no one robs you or worse while you're vulnerable. There's no paper. You use leaves or your hand or nothing at all. Breakfast isn't a meal. It's whatever you can afford and whatever didn't spoil overnight. If you have money, you might buy hardtack and coffee from a merchant who's charging 10 times what it's worth. The hardtack is so hard it could break your teeth. The coffee is weak and bitter, probably mixed with dirt to stretch it further. If you don't have money, you don't eat. Simple as that. You'll work all day on an empty stomach and hope tomorrow is better. Your clothing is rotting on your body. You wear the same outfit every day because you only own one outfit. It's stiff with dried sweat and dirt. The seams are splitting. Your boots, if you have boots, have holes. Your feet are always wet or blistered. You can't afford to replace anything, so you'll wear these clothes until they literally fall apart. Hygiene is impossible. You haven't had a real bath in weeks, maybe months. Water is too scarce and too valuable to waste on bathing. Your hair is matted. Your skin itches constantly from lice and fleas that you can't get rid of. Your teeth hurt, they're probably rotting, but there's no dentist and no treatment. You just live with the pain. The weather is your enemy. In winter, you're never warm. Your shelter, tent, or shack has gaps where wind and rain come through. You have one blanket if you're lucky. You shiver through the nights and wake up with frost on your blanket. In summer, the heat is crushing. There's no shade, no cool place to rest. The sun beats down relentlessly. People die of heat stroke regularly, and you might be next. Everything you own fits in a small bag. A change of socks if you're fortunate. A tin cup, maybe a knife. Some people have a photograph of family they left behind. That photograph gets more worn every time you look at it, and you look at it often, trying to remember why you came here. Meals, when they happen, are joyless. You eat alone or in silence with others. The food has no flavor beyond salt, beans, salt pork, maybe some bread if you can afford it. You eat quickly, not because you're hungry, though you are, but because eating slowly just makes you more aware of how terrible the food is. You're malnourished. Your body is slowly breaking down from lack of vitamins and nutrients. Your gums bleed when you bite into hard food. That's scurvy. You're surrounded by waste. Garbage piles up everywhere because there's no collection, no disposal system. Flies swarm in black clouds. Rats are everywhere, bold enough to run across your feet in daylight. The ground is contaminated with waste. Everything is contaminated. You accept this because there's no alternative. Every day you witness death or near death. Someone in your camp or boarding house is always sick, always suffering. You hear them groaning through the thin walls. You step over people lying in the streets, unsure if they're drunk, sick, or dead. Sometimes you check, sometimes you don't. You've learned not to care too much because caring is exhausting and changes nothing. The daily routine is grinding sameness. Wake in darkness and discomfort. Try to find food. Work until your body screams for rest. Try to find more food. Work more. Go to sleep cold, hungry, and hurting. Repeat tomorrow and the next day. And the day after that. There are no days off, no weekends, no holidays that matter. Every day is the same struggle, the same darkness, the same slow erosion of your body and spirit. This is daily life, not the dramatic moments. The grinding, relentless darkness of trying to survive another 24 hours. And most people lived like this for years, however many years they lasted before California killed them. Let's talk about work, because work was where the darkness of daily life became most obvious. This wasn't work in any sense we'd recognize today. This was systematic brutalization disguised as employment. If you were a laborer, and most people were, your day started before dawn and ended after dark. 12 to 16 hours was standard. Some jobs demanded 18 or 20 hours during peak seasons. There were no breaks mandated by law, no lunch hour, no rest periods. You worked until you physically couldn't continue, and then you worked some more because stopping meant not getting paid. Mining was the most common work, and it was designed to destroy you. You stood in icy water for hours at a time, bent at the waist, moving rocks and sifting through gravel. The water was so cold that many miners lost feeling in their hands and feet permanently. The bent position destroyed your back. By 30, miners looked 50. By 40, they were broken old men, if they lived that long. The water you stood in was toxic. Mercury was used extensively in gold processing, and it contaminated every waterway. You absorbed it through your skin. You breathed the vapors. Mercury poisoning caused tremors, mental instability, and eventually death. They called it Mad Hatter's disease. You'd slowly lose your mind while your body deteriorated. There was no treatment. You just went insane and died. Your hands bled constantly from handling sharp rocks. Infections were common. Your fingernails split and fell off. Your joints swelled with arthritis. Your spine compressed from the constant bending. This wasn't work that aged you naturally. It actively destroyed your body, piece by piece, day by day. And for this, you earned maybe $2 to $4 per day if you were lucky. That sounds okay until you realize that food cost $1.50 per day minimum, shelter cost another $1 per day, and you needed to replace tools and clothing constantly. You were barely breaking even, and any unexpected expense, illness, injury, theft, put you in debt. Chinese workers earned half what white workers made for identical labor. They were paid $1 to $2 per day and charged the same prices for everything. They couldn't afford to eat adequately on those wages. They survived on rice when they could get it. Many died of malnutrition while doing backbreaking work. Women who worked, and they had few options, faced exploitation that was even darker. Domestic work meant 18-hour days washing clothes by hand in freezing water, cooking over fires, cleaning without proper tools. You earned maybe $20 per month, barely enough to rent a corner of a room. The work destroyed your hands. The hot water and harsh soap left your skin cracked and bleeding. Your back gave out from hauling water and scrubbing floors. Many women turned to prostitution because it was often the only way to earn enough money to survive. But survival came at an unthinkable cost. Disease was universal. Violence was constant. Most sex workers died before 30, worn out and discarded. Children worked too. Boys as young as 7 worked in mines doing jobs adults couldn't or wouldn't do, crawling into narrow spaces, handling explosives, sorting ore. They were paid almost nothing. Their bodies were stunted by the work. Their childhoods were simply erased. Girls worked as domestic servants or in factories when they existed. They earned even less than boys. They were vulnerable to every form of exploitation. Their value was measured solely in their labor output. When they were used up, they were thrown away. There were no workplace safety regulations. Mines collapsed regularly, burying workers. No one dug them out if the rescue looked too expensive. Explosives detonated prematurely, blowing men apart. Tools malfunctioned, crushing hands and limbs. Falls from scaffolding broke backs and skulls. These weren't freak accidents. They were daily occurrences accepted as the cost of doing business. If you were injured on the job, you were fired. No compensation, no medical care, no second chances. You simply lost your ability to work, which meant you lost your ability to survive. Injured workers begged in the streets or starved to death. That was the system. Employers cheated constantly. They'd short your wages, claiming the gold yield was lower than it was. They'd decharge you for tools and materials, leaving you with almost nothing at the end of the week. If you complained, you were fired and blacklisted. Other workers were warned not to hire you. You'd never work again. Debt was weaponized. Many workers were forced to buy supplies from company stores at inflated prices. You'd owe more at the end of the week than you earned. The debt accumulated until you were essentially enslaved. You couldn't leave because you owed money. You couldn't pay the debt because the interest was too high. You were trapped, working until you died, never getting free. The darkness of work in early California wasn't just the physical danger or the low pay. It was the complete lack of dignity. You weren't a person. You were a tool that produced value for someone else. When you broke, you were replaced. Your life had no intrinsic worth, only the worth of what you could produce before you died. And most people died producing very little. They worked themselves to death for others' profit, and their bodies were buried in unmarked graves that no one remembered. Death was the constant companion of daily life in early California. Not dramatic death, not heroic death. Slow, ugly, routine death that came for everyone eventually and came early for most. Let's start with the diseases. Cholera swept through California repeatedly in the 1850s, killing thousands. The disease hit fast and killed faster. You'd feel fine in the morning. By noon, you'd have stomach cramps. By sunset, you'd be dead, your body so dehydrated it looked mummified. The speed was horrifying. People you talked to at breakfast were corpses before dinner. Cholera came from contaminated water, and all water in mining areas and towns was contaminated. Sewage ran into rivers. Bodies decomposed upstream from where people drank. Dead animals rotted in water sources. Every drink was Russian roulette. You got cholera not if you were unlucky, but when. It was only a matter of time. Typhoid was slower but just as deadly. The fever would spike until you were delirious. You'd waste away over weeks, unable to keep food down, losing weight until you looked skeletal. There was no treatment. You either survived or you didn't, and most didn't. Typhoid killed thousands more. Dysentery, bloody diarrhea from bacteria in filthy water, was so common people called it the California quickstep. It sounds almost funny until you realize it killed constantly. You'd dehydrate rapidly. Your body would flush out fluids faster than you could replace them. Combined with malnutrition, it was a death sentence for many. Tuberculosis spread in the crowded, poorly ventilated spaces where people lived. You'd cough blood for months, each breath harder than the last until your lungs were so scarred you suffocated slowly. TB was contagious, so you infected everyone around you. Entire camps would be consumed by it. The coughing never stopped. It was the background sound of daily life. And the coughing always meant someone was dying. Pneumonia killed people every winter. The cold, the damp, the lack of adequate shelter, all of it conspired to fill your lungs with fluid. You drowned slowly from the inside. There was no treatment. Doctors, when they existed, could do nothing but watch you die. Scurvy rotted you from the inside. Without vitamin C from fresh fruits and vegetables, which most people couldn't afford, your body broke down. Your gums bled. Your teeth fell out. Old wounds reopened. You bruised at the slightest touch. Eventually, you bled internally and died. It was completely preventable, but poverty made it common. Injuries were just as deadly as disease. Without antibiotics or proper medical care, any injury could kill you. A cut on your hand would become infected. The infection would spread up your arm. Red streaks appeared on your skin, blood poisoning. You develop a fever, become delirious, and die within days. This happened constantly. Broken bones often meant death. Without proper setting and treatment, bones healed wrong or not at all. If the break was bad enough, they just amputated. They'd saw off your limb with no anesthesia while you screamed. If you survived the shock and pain, infection would probably kill you anyway. If you somehow survived that, you were now disabled in a world that had no use for disabled people. Burns were common from the open fires everyone used for cooking and heat. Severe burns became infected immediately. Your skin would rot. The smell was unbearable. The pain was beyond description. Most burn victims died slowly in agony with no pain relief. Medical care was primitive and often harmful. Doctors were frequently frauds with no training. They'd prescribe mercury for everything, which poisoned you. They'd bleed you, which weakened you. They deperformed surgeries in filthy conditions with unsterilized tools, ensuring infection. Real doctors were rare and expensive. Most people never saw one. When you were sick or injured, you suffered alone and hoped you survived. Most of the time, you didn't. Childbirth killed women constantly. Without proper medical care, complications that are treatable today were death sentences then. Women died of hemorrhaging, died of infection, died of exhaustion during long, difficult labors. Babies died during birth or in the days following. Maternal and infant mortality rates were astronomically high. Death was so routine it stopped being shocking. People died in the streets and were left there until someone bothered to move them. Bodies were buried in shallow graves that animals dug up. Mass graves appeared after disease outbreaks. The cemeteries in any town were larger than the living settlements. People died alone, unmourned, and forgot. They'd come to California with hopes and plans, and they died in the mud, and no one knew their names. Their families back home might never learn what happened. They just vanished into California's darkness. The average life expectancy for someone living in a California mining camp was probably mid-30s. Think about that. Most people were dead before 40, not from old age, from disease, injury, and the grinding brutality of daily existence. This wasn't occasional tragedy. This was the norm. Death was woven into every day. You expected it, prepared for it, knew it was coming. The darkness of daily life in early California meant living with the certainty that you probably wouldn't live long, and that when you died, it would be ugly, painful, and meaningless. The darkness of daily life in early California wasn't just physical hardship and disease. It was the constant, grinding fear of violence that could come at any moment from any direction. There was no real law enforcement in most places. Mining camps had no police. Larger towns might have a sheriff, but he was usually corrupt, overwhelmed, or both. The law existed primarily to protect property owners and merchants. If you were ordinary or poor, you had no protection from anything. Murder was shockingly common. In San Francisco during the early 1850s, multiple people were murdered every single day. Bodies turned up in alleys in the bay on the outskirts of town. Most murders were never investigated. They just happened and life went on. In mining camps, men killed each other over claims, over perceived insults, over money, over nothing at all. Arguments escalated to violence instantly because everyone was armed and no one trusted anyone. A disagreement about a card game could end with someone shot dead on the floor. This happened nightly. The darkness of this violence was its randomness. You could be killed for being in the wrong place, for looking at someone wrong, for having something someone else wanted. There was no pattern, no way to stay safe except luck. Robbery was constant. Your possessions, meager as they were targets. People stole tools, clothing, food, money, anything of value. If you resisted, they'd kill you without hesitation. Most people didn't resist. You just accepted the loss because your life was worth more than your belongings. But sometimes you couldn't afford to lose what was stolen. Sometimes that was your only pair of boots or your only tool or your last food. Then you starved or froze because someone took what you needed to survive. The darkness wasn't just the theft, it was knowing that theft could kill you slowly. Sexual violence was pervasive and unpunished. Women lived in constant fear. Assault was common and rarely reported because reporting meant being blamed, shamed, or disbelieved. The few women in early California were targeted constantly. Many carried weapons and slept lightly, knowing no one would protect them. Vigilante justice was the only justice, and it was brutal and arbitrary. Communities would form mobs to capture suspected criminals and hold immediate trials. No real evidence, no due process, just a mob deciding guilt and carrying out punishment, usually hanging within hours. The darkness here was that innocent people were lynched regularly. If you were the wrong race or in the wrong place or just unlucky, you could be accused of something you didn't do and hanged before sunset. No one questioned it. The mob wanted blood and they got it. Lynchings were public entertainment. People gathered to watch. They brought their children. They cheered when the person dropped. This casual relationship with violence, this acceptance of murder as normal, defined daily life. You lived in a society that had normalized killing. Racial violence was systematic and horrifying. Chinese immigrants were attacked regularly by white workers who blamed them for low wages. Mobs raided Chinese camps, beating and killing residents, burning their homes. The law did nothing. Sometimes the law participated. Native Americans faced genocidal violence. State-funded militias hunted them. Bounties were paid for scalps, including children's scalps. Villages were massacred. People were killed for sport. This was official policy, encouraged by the government. Mexican residents who'd lived in California before U.S. annexation were driven from their land through violence and legal theft. Their property was taken. Their families were terrorized. When they resisted, they were killed. The darkness was that this violence had the blessing of authority. Workplace violence was routine. Bosses and foremen beat workers who complained or slowed down. You could be whipped, kicked, or struck with tools for not working fast enough. If you fought back, you'd be fired or killed. The workplace was a space of constant physical intimidation. Domestic violence was unreported and unaddressed. Women were beaten by husbands or employers. Children were beaten by anyone with authority over them. This violence was considered normal, even appropriate. There was no escape for victims, no shelter, no help. Just endless abuse. The darkness of violence in daily life was its inescapability. You couldn't avoid it, couldn't protect yourself adequately, couldn't appeal to any authority for help. You just lived with the knowledge that violence could erupt at any second, and when it did, you'd probably be hurt or killed. Every day you walked streets where people had been murdered. Every night you heard screams and gunshots. Every morning you might find a body near where you slept. This was normal. This was daily life. The violence broke something in people. They became numb to it, stopped reacting to horror, accepted brutality as the natural state of things. That numbness, that deadening of human empathy, was maybe the darkest part of all. California didn't just kill people's bodies. It killed something essential in their spirits. If daily life in early California was dark for everyone, it was absolutely pitch black for women, children, and immigrants. These groups experienced layers of horror that most people today can't begin to comprehend. Women in early California lived in a special kind of hell. They made up less than 10% of the population in the early years, which meant they were simultaneously valuable and completely vulnerable. Every woman was seen as either a potential wife, a potential prostitute, or a domestic servant. Those were essentially the only roles available. If you were a married woman, Your daily life was crushing labor with no recognition or rest. You cooked over open fires that burned your face and hands. You washed clothes by hand in freezing water that destroyed your skin. You bore children in conditions that frequently killed both mother and baby. You had no legal rights. Your husband owned you and everything you produced. Many women came to California pregnant or with small children, and they gave birth in tents, in wagons, in mining camps with no medical care. The mortality rate for childbirth was staggering. You survived if you were lucky. Your babies survived if they were even luckier. Most women lost at least one child. Many lost several. Single women had almost no legitimate options for survival. Domestic work paid almost nothing and subjected you to constant harassment and assault from employers. The hours were endless. The conditions were brutal. You had no legal protection from abuse. So many women turned to prostitution, not as a choice, but because it was the only way to earn enough money to live. And the darkness of sex work in early California is almost unbearable to describe. Most prostitutes were dead before 30. They died of disease. Syphilis and gonorrhea were universal and untreatable. They died of violence from clients. They died of botched abortions. They died of suicide when the suffering became too much. The prostitutes' lives were daily nightmares. Multiple clients per day, violent clients, drunk clients, clients who refused to pay. You had no protection. If a man beat you or killed you, no one investigated. Your life was considered worthless. Women had no legal recourse for anything. If you were raped, the law blamed you. If you were beaten, it was considered a private matter. If you were robbed or cheated, you had no standing to seek justice. You existed in a society that viewed you as less than human. Children in early California had no childhood. They worked as soon as they could walk. 5-year-olds hauled water. 7-year-olds worked in mines. 10-year-olds did adult labor for a fraction of adult wages. There were no child labor laws, no protections, no recognition that children deserved safety or education or rest. Children were simply small workers who could be exploited more easily than adults. The darkness for children was that their suffering was invisible. No one thought it was wrong. It was just how things were. Children were worked until they were injured or killed, and then they were replaced with other children. Their small bodies broke under labor they weren't developed to handle. Orphans were everywhere. Parents died constantly from disease, violence, and work accidents. When they died, their children had nowhere to go. Some were taken in by adults who used them as unpaid labor. Others lived on the streets, begging or stealing to survive. Many didn't survive. They just disappeared and no one noticed. Immigrant experiences varied by race, but all faced darkness that native-born whites didn't. Chinese immigrants faced systematic discrimination designed to keep them poor and powerless. They were paid half the wages for the same work. They were charged discriminatory taxes. They lived in segregated areas with the worst conditions. Chinese workers were blamed for every social problem. White workers, angry about their own exploitation, took it out on the Chinese instead of on the employers exploiting both groups. This violence was encouraged by authorities as a way to prevent workers from organizing together. Chinese workers built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad, and they died by the thousands doing it. They were given the most dangerous jobs, setting explosives, working on cliff faces, tunneling through mountains. When they died, they were simply replaced. Their deaths weren't even counted. Mexican immigrants and Mexican residents who'd lived in California before annexation faced violence and legal theft. Their land was taken through fraud or force. Their property rights, supposedly protected by treaty, were ignored by American courts. They were transformed from landowners to laborers overnight. Mexican workers faced constant discrimination and violence. They were paid less than white workers. They were driven from good mining claims at gunpoint. They were blamed and punished for crimes they didn't commit. The legal system offered them no protection. Indigenous people faced the worst darkness of all. What happened to California's native population during this era can only be described as genocide. The population dropped from roughly 150,000 in 1848 to less than 30,000 by 1870. Disease killed many, but systematic violence killed more. State-funded militias hunted Native Americans for sport and profit. Bounties were paid for scalps. Villages were raided and destroyed. Women were raped. Children were kidnapped and sold into indentured servitude that was slavery in all but name. Native people who survived were displaced from their lands, starved through destruction of their food sources, and forced into labor for minimal or no compensation. They had no legal rights, no protection, no recognition of their humanity. The darkness for all these groups, women, children, immigrants, indigenous people, was that their suffering was built into the system. It wasn't an accident or an unfortunate side effect. It was the goal. Their exploitation was how early California functioned. Their pain was the foundation on which prosperity was built for others. And daily life for them meant waking up every morning knowing you had less value, fewer rights, and more danger than others simply because of who you were. That darkness, that daily reminder of your designated worthlessness, may have been the cruelest part of all. If you had to identify the absolute darkest moment of daily life in early California, the period when the accumulated horrors reached their peak, it would be the winter of 1856–1857. This was 3 years into the vigilante era in San Francisco, when mob rule had become completely normalized. This was during a severe economic depression, when work disappeared and thousands were suddenly unemployed with no savings and no safety net. And this was an unusually harsh winter that trapped people in conditions they couldn't escape. In the mining camps, supplies ran out. The trails were impassable due to snow. Food prices skyrocketed what little food remained. People were starving in camps all across the Sierra Nevada, not just hungry, starving, eating leather, eating anything remotely organic, watching their companions die of hunger and cold. The darkness intensified because people knew help wasn't coming. The storms were too severe. The snow was too deep. They were trapped with dwindling food, failing bodies, and the certainty that many of them would die before spring. In the camps, people turned on each other. Food was stolen. Violence erupted over scraps. The social bonds that had barely existed dissolved completely. Everyone was an enemy. Everyone was competition for the resources needed to survive one more day. Some people simply gave up. They lay down in their tents and waited to die. And they did die, dozens in each camp. Their bodies frozen solid, left where they died because no one had the energy to bury them and the ground was too frozen to dig anyway. In San Francisco, the Depression meant thousands of unemployed men with no prospects. Desperate people committed desperate crimes. The vigilance committees responded with more hangings, more violence. The streets were patrolled by armed mobs who acted as judge, jury, and executioner. The darkness in San Francisco that winter was social collapse. The thin veneer of civilization disappeared. What remained was raw fear and violence. People stayed indoors as much as possible. Businesses closed. The city felt like a war zone because it essentially was one, a war of everyone against everyone. Families disintegrated under the pressure. Husbands abandoned wives. Parents abandoned children they couldn't feed. People fled alone, trying to save themselves, leaving behind anyone who would slow them down. The darkness reached its peak when you realized there was no bottom. Things didn't get so bad that they had to get better. They just got worse, and worse, and worse. Until you couldn't imagine things getting worse, and then they did. Disease spread through weakened populations. Pneumonia, typhoid, influenza, the death rate spiked. Graves couldn't be dug fast enough. Bodies piled up. And through all of this, the wealthy were mostly fine. They had food. They had warmth. They had security. The darkness was that the suffering was concentrated entirely on ordinary people, while those with resources were insulated from almost all of it. That winter represented everything dark about early California compressed into a few months. The violence, the starvation, the disease, the cold, the fear, the complete absence of help or hope, all of it happening simultaneously to people who were already broken. When spring finally came, the survivors emerged traumatized. They'd watched people die. They'd done things to survive they'd never speak of again. They learned that California was darkness, real, physical, inescapable darkness, and that most people didn't survive it. You need to understand how impossibly different your life is from theirs. When you wake up tomorrow morning, you'll do it in a safe bed in a secure shelter. The water you drink will be clean. The food you eat will be safe and abundant. You'll have clothing that's clean and intact. You'll have access to medical care that can treat almost anything that would have killed someone in 1850s California instantly. If you're cold, you adjust the thermostat. If you're hot, you turn on a fan or air conditioning. If you're hungry, you open the refrigerator. If you're sick, you take medicine or see a doctor. If you're threatened, you call police. If you're injured, you go to a hospital where they'll save your life with antibiotics and sterile surgery. None of that existed in early California. None of it. Today, you don't wake up wondering if you'll find food. You don't drink water knowing it might kill you. You don't work 16 hours in conditions that will destroy your body. You don't live in constant fear of violence with no protection. You don't watch people die routinely and accept it as normal. Your life expectancy is roughly double what theirs was. The diseases that killed them by the thousands are either eradicated or easily treatable. The injuries that would have killed them are minor inconveniences for you. The darkness that defined their daily existence simply doesn't exist in your world. You live in unprecedented safety, health, and comfort. Even if you're struggling financially today, you have protections and options they never dreamed of. This isn't about being ungrateful for modern problems. Modern problems are real. But you need perspective on how dark daily life used to be, how recently that darkness was normal. The people who suffered through early California built the foundation for the world you live in. Their darkness purchased your light. Their deaths created the systems that keep you alive. Every protection you have, every right you enjoy, every safety net that exists, all of it was built on the suffering of people who had none of those things. When you go to sleep tonight in comfort and safety, think about them trying to sleep in the cold and dark, knowing tomorrow would bring more suffering and that there was no escape. Be grateful. Be so grateful you live now and not then. The dark reality of daily life in early California was worse than anything you've experienced or can fully imagine. Every single day was darkness. Physical darkness in unsafe shelters, social darkness in a lawless society, moral darkness in a system that valued profit over human life, spiritual darkness in the absence of hope or escape. People didn't just die in early California, they died ugly, painful, meaningless deaths after lives of unrelenting suffering, and most of them are forgotten. We don't know their names. We don't know their stories. We just know they suffered and died building something they never got to enjoy. When you learned about California history in school, they probably didn't tell you any of this. They told you about gold rushes and pioneers and progress. They left out the darkness because the darkness doesn't fit the narrative of American exceptionalism. But the darkness was real. It was the daily reality for hundreds of thousands of people, and they deserve to be remembered, not for inspiration or pride, but for what they actually endured. You live in their light. Your comfortable, safe, healthy life exists because they suffered through darkness so profound it would break you within days. Honor them by understanding what they went through. Honor them by being grateful for what you have. Honor them by recognizing that the world you live in is extraordinary and recent and fragile. If this documentary opened your eyes to the dark reality that's been hidden in California's past, there are more stories like this on this channel. Every state has darkness in its history that's been forgotten or sanitized. Don't let it stay hidden. Watch the other documentaries. Learn the truth, and be grateful, deeply, genuinely grateful, that you live now instead of then. Because if you'd lived through the dark reality of daily life in early California, you probably wouldn't have survived.